In this video, I will be discussing the polarity between science and mysticism. The importance of this video will be my attempt to integrate the two dualities. And instead of showing they are incompatible, they rather need each other. My argument is sorted into two parts: the good, the true, and the beautiful. In this first part of this video, I will be defining science and the problem of its limitations, the true. In the second part of this video, I will be talking about meaning and atheism, the good and the beautiful. We are free to define science any way we wish, as long as we advance to produce precisely the conclusion desired. A quite literal definition is knowledge, just like omniscience stands for all-knowing. In this case, physics becomes a science, but also contemplative religion becomes a form of science. This may not really satisfy scientists and atheists their meaning of it. On the other hand, if you define it as empirical sensory knowledge instrumentally validated, then virtually all forms of religion become non-scientific. Now, the method of science refers to the ways or means that whatever it is we call science manages to gather facts, data, or information and manages to refute that data. The scientific domain simply refers to the type of events that become objects of investigation. Think about biology, chemistry, psychology, quantum mechanics, yada yada yada. The method is essentially its epistemology, and the domain its ontology. Now, there has been some debate over whether or not psychology is really a science, because our thoughts are harder to empirically investigate. Let's see what the internet has to say. Is psychology really a science? So no, it is not the case that hard science has facts and psychology has theories. We all only have theories. In every way, psychological science adheres to the scientific method as much as any other science. Why is psychology a science? Science studies overt behavior because overt behavior is objectively observable and can be measured, allowing different psychologists to record behavior and agree on what has been observed. This means that evidence can be collected to test a theory about people. The problem is that sense experience is being negated. Values, meaning, beauty, and morals are reduced to chemical processes, upon which it basically loses its meaning. Only empirically observable behavior is worthy of investigation. According to this objectivist view, there is no difference in value between two opposing thoughts. Scientists, when they investigate people with a mental disorder, ask, what does it do? And not like a psychologist would ask, what does it mean? Psychologists not only investigate behavior, but they also investigate unobservable thought processes. Of course, they can only get an idea about the patient's thoughts by observing their behavior. Psychologists just tend to show more importance for psychosomatic illnesses. This also causes quantum mechanics to be a very narrow-minded subject. If science were restricted to physical sensory object domains, then mathematics, logic, psychology, and sociology could not be called scientific. Okay, the limitations of science. These are the four quadrants made by Ken Wilber. Science tends to value the upper right exterior individual and the lower right exterior collective realms. Within these realms, anything from the physical to the objective belongs here. The interior individual and interior collective get disvalued and thrown out by the pragmatic scientists. These realms are all about values, beauty, symbols, and morals. The negation of the left side is caused by a subtle reductionism in people and mindset. You might have it that physics, biology, and psychology are all scientific domains which belong to the right side exterior individual and exterior collective realms, which means these domains only investigate anything that is observable. The problem is that physics, biology, and psychology become very narrow, and limited, since only their exterior aspects are taken into account. You cannot study psychology, biology, or physics without their interior aspects. Now, science deals with form, matter, and shape. The mystical is about the shapeless and the immaterial. You might think there is a great division, but most scientists and physicists are actually a type of mystic. Operating with mathematics is similar to a mystic performing magic with symbols. Physicists will contradict themselves, asserting that magic is arbitrary and mysticism to be irrational. Science, it is believed, is empirical and non-arbitrary. We consider it to be a bad thing to be inconsistent. Similarly, we criticize others for failing to appreciate, at least the more obvious, logical consequences of their beliefs. In both cases, there is a failure to conform one's attitudes to logical strictures. We generally take agents who fall short of the demands of logic to be rationally defective. This suggests that logic has a normative role to play in our rational economy. It instructs us how we ought or ought not to think or reason. The notion that logic has such a normative role to play is deeply anchored where we traditionally think about and teach logic. There is still dispute over the normative status of logic and mathematics, and there are truth theorists claiming that logic is nothing more than conceptual. One approach has it that logic's normative role in thinking or reasoning may be partly definite of what logic is. Hartree-Field, for one, advances an account of validity along these lines. In his 2015, he argues that neither the standard model or proof-theoretic accounts of validity nor the notion of necessary truth privation in virtue of logical form succeed in capturing the notion of validity. Thus, currently, while no real truth theory seems to be evident, logic is arbitrary. Also, mathematics seem to be incomplete. In 1911, Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead completed a monumental work, Principia Mathematica, which sought to provide a solid foundation to all mathematics. All attempts to form a mathematical system must begin from the ground up with a set of axioms. For example, Euclid wrote the Elements with a foundation of just 5 axioms. Hilbert and others expressed concern that an axiomatic basis for a mathematical system might contain subtle inconsistencies. In other words, one axiom might conflict with another in a way that the conflict could manifest itself in a theorem such that the theorem could be proven both true and false, a paradox. Thus Russell and Whitehead took up this challenge. Their solution was to recast the foundations of mathematics in the terse language of logic and sets. By driving out language and using just symbols, their intention was to create an entirely consistent system for mathematics without the risk of subtle ambiguity that the words of a spoken language might entail. Attaching meaning to these symbols was called by Hilbert and others meta-mathematics. But there was a monster growling in the closet, self-reference. The law of excluded middle can fail when a statement refers back to itself, producing a paradox. The simplest paradox takes the logical form of this statement. This statement is false. The statement cannot be true, because then it would be false. But if it was false, then it must be a true statement. Such a bizarre logical problem can arise through self-reference or circular reasoning. The statement refers to itself to prove an assertion about itself. It was thought that Russell and Whitehead had avoided all possibility of self-reference, and thus had a logical foundation for mathematics that was entirely consistent. No contradictory results. While studying Principia, Gödel had a brilliant insight. In looking at the mass of logical statements, he began to imagine that each logical symbol could be assigned a unique number. We call them Gödel numbers. and that each logical statement could be represented by a unique number formed by multiplying the Gödel numbers therein. Thus he saw that Principia was a book about numbers, which used numbers to prove itself. It was a subtle form of self-reference, which meant that there might be trouble. Here are the glimpses of the origins of Gödel's incompleteness theorem. This shows that mathematics and logic are arbitrary, and thus have no foundation which proves its normativity. Mathematics and logic have become a mystical practice of symbols. Alright, the mysticism of laws. You may have heard of Charles Darwin's natural selection, but where is it? You can look at pictures of humans and animals and notice that each individual has certain characteristics, but this tells you nothing about evolution. Evolution cannot be seen within one individual, since evolution by definition means to evolve from one point to another point. You can view evolution by looking at the bigger picture. You cannot see evolution by individually looking at an ape and individually looking at a human. Evolution can be seen when looking at the progression from ape to human. Thus, the idea of evolution cannot be observed in the real world. Physics. We have what we call relational properties and intrinsic properties. Relational properties are properties relative to something else, and intrinsic properties are properties had by the object. The ball has the intrinsic property of being bouncy and round. The rock has the properties of being heavy and solid. The property being in front of is not a property had by the ball, because from a different viewpoint, the rock will be in front of the ball. The property being in front of is a relational property. I believe the laws of nature are like this. You don't see gravity in action when you only see one object in a vacuum. But when two objects float towards each other, you can see gravity in action. Therefore, the laws of nature are not imposed onto reality. That is what Peter Atkins told in one of his talks on the origins of laws of nature. He explains the laws of nature according to three principles: indolence, anarchy, and ignorance. Now, I still need to learn more about physics and read his book to understand his idea that the laws of nature come from nothing. But it seems to me that if the laws of nature come from nothing, they might as well just be a mere belief you make when viewing the relations between events. Not only this, but explaining the laws of nature by principles begs the question, because principles are not objective either. Principles cannot be found floating around in the air. They can only be seen in action, and yet the laws of nature always apply even when you don't. This doesn't mean his explanation must be false. It is perhaps incomplete, but still, I need to read this book first to better understand his ideas. Okay, psychology. But if laws are unobservable and worthy of investigation, then so are phenomena like the law of attraction, categorical imperatives, self-fulfilling prophecies, the law of reversed effects, or other laws are worthy of investigation. Now, I'm skeptical. I do not believe that if you think cars can fall from the sky, it will happen right that moment because your frequencies fine-tune with vibrations within reality. But I do think that if you believe you can earn a car, you will, sometimes but not always, slowly start to see opportunities to fulfill your desire. Immanuel Kant came up with the categorical imperative, which maintains humans are obligated by a universal moral law we can know through reason. These moral laws are forms of etiquette, somewhat like treat others as you like to be treated. There are, however, no such universal moral laws to be found. I think this can only be used as a principle which can be viewed between the interaction of people. And of course, the categorical imperative always applies in an interaction. It can only exist when we notice it. Foundations of scientific method. Induction. It is commonly believed the scientific method bases its inquiry on induction, and from these empirical observations we make hypotheses. The purpose of the scientific method is to make unbiased predictions about the world. Because biases make a certain inclination or prejudice towards something which don't always correspond with the natural world. Science pursues the correspondence between truth and objectivism. After experiments have been done, there will be people who will try to use evidence to validate some belief and reject evidence which disproves their belief. This is known as confirmation bias. For example, a belief in God is a certain predisposition we can have. Theists will only accept evidence for God but not against it. Science seeks answers without religious or philosophical prejudice on the matter at hand. Sabine Hossenfelder addresses this aesthetic prejudice in physics in her book called Lost in Math. Physicists are often persuaded by philosophical ideas, and because of this, there has been no breakthrough in the last 40 years. And this is the crisis in physics. She describes it. Probability. Induction is important for other reasons as well. Physical events, for instance, can either validate or falsify probabilities we make about our natural world. The reoccurrence of outcomes can validate probable reasoning. If we observe the sun returns tomorrow, we can make a certain prediction that the sun either arises the next day or it doesn't. Each time the sun returns, the higher the probability the sun returns the next day. And this is how we test hypotheses. Scientists unbiasedly perform experiments, and the more the result corresponds with the assertion, the higher of a probability assertion will be true. Now, this form of experiment obviously requires induction because we make future predictions about the world, and the world needs to validate those predictions. So here is a very short overview of the scientific method. Now, it is not really complete or powerful, but good enough for now. I'm very young and there is still a lot to learn, so I might change my views on the scientific method when I've learned more. Genius and insanity. Now, dopamine is sometimes confused as a feel-good chemical. This is partially true. Dopamine plays a big role in anticipating the future too. It is the chemical causing us to want things, but not always enjoy what we already have. Dopamine always anticipates the future and never sees the finish line. When a person lives underneath a bridge, they want a tent. And when people have a tent, they want a house. And when they have a house, they want a mansion. And when they have a mansion, they want a castle on the moon. Anticipation requires the ability to think about the future. Norepinephrine works the opposite way. It enjoys what it currently has. Also, dreams require the ability to abstract thinking, which explains why during dreams the brain produces higher doses of dopamine. Abstract thinking, creativity, and dopamine are related, but in people whose brain is making more dopamine, there is a lack of norepinephrine. What they currently have already doesn't satisfy them. But think carefully. What type of people think abstractly as well? Geniuses. But with genius comes a cost, insanity. Scientists observed schizophrenics make higher doses of dopamine, and one time a man was watching a movie upon which a scene of a stop sign was on the screen. At that moment, a rush of dopamine released, which caused the man to believe it was a secret message from his mom not to watch women anymore. Dopamine causes us to think unrelated events are secret messages to us. Isaac Newton, who discovered gravity, was a genius, but also very disillusioned. He was searching for secret messages in the Bible and occupied himself with occultism. Other effects which come with abstract thinking are maladaptive daydreaming syndrome, something like how schizophrenics cannot stop hearing voices inside their heads. Genius people are more likely to daydream more and not stop excessive thinking. They are also more likely to become addicted and change partners a lot. When we are happy with the partner we are with, dopamine switches to norepinephrine to be happy with who we are already with. This is important for long-lasting relationships. Geniuses are, however, more likely to be socially inept and be unhappy with their partners because they always want more. Now, philosophical biases, like we have dealt with before, are prohibited in science because it prejudices evidence. But philosophical or religious beliefs essentially require abstract thinking. In fact, many popular scientists had some philosophical beliefs. Think of Albert Einstein, who was a pantheist, or Isaac Newton, who was a Christian. Science, by the way, is progressive, always looks forward into the future. Just like dopamine always wants more, it has no limit. Science needs beliefs to look forward to. If a belief in intelligent life out in the universe wasn't motivating science, science wouldn't be at the point it currently is. The conclusion I'm trying to make is that science needs beauty in order to progress. Therefore, science isn't unbiased. However, there's always something we believe, whether it's true or not. Okay, Bayesian probability theorem. Jean Piaget developed a model called genetic epistemology and argued humans progress through specific cognitive phases. Children aged around 12 develop abstract reasoning skills as part of their last stage of cognitive development. In this stage, the person no longer needs concrete objects to make rational judgments. At this point, people are capable of hypothetical and deductive reasoning. The scientific method is very limited in its definition. Discovery and research doesn't come down to what is observable. Science requires abstract thinking and hypothetical and deductive reasoning. I think I've already emphasized this point clearly enough when we have looked into mathematical symbols. Now, also probable reasoning is very abstract. Thomas Bayes proved probabilities are essentially subjective. Objectively, events can only be 100% likely or 0% likely. But there is no objective event which is 50% likely. This goes against the law of excluded middle and the law of non-contradiction. Now, of course, predictions are validated when they are proven to be true by the physical world, but the prediction in itself is abstract. So far we have dealt with the true. Here I will be dealing with the good and the beautiful. Or you can view this as an exegesis about faith, belief and reason. Okay, atheism. Neo-Darwinism. Neo-Darwinism maintains the occurrence of accidental changes in heritage are based on natural selection. Most Neo-Darwinists believe society can only progress with rational species. This scary and harsh viewpoint can be seen back in philosophies like fascism or ethical rationalism. Ethical rationalism is an ethical theory which started with Kant. It wasn't until Dutch philosopher Wim Rietvink applied a Neo-Darwinist aspect to it, the theory was viewed as counterintuitive. Currently, some people are relieved he died recently because of his often radical ideas. Rietvink wasn't a difficult person, however, people just didn't like his ideas. He maintains the government spends 2 million euros on jobless people. We would, according to him, be better off euthanizing and sterilizing irrational and handicapped people. A more popular Dutch psychologist, Adriaan de Groot, was also a Neo-Darwinist. But his ideas impacted Holland's educational system severely. The Netherlands works with this hierarchy with people who are less educated are to be considered more found below, and the smarter people higher up in the hierarchy of the educational system. Okay, epigenetics. These convictions have some limitations, fortunate enough. The doctrine of adaptive mutations is somewhat of a replacement of Neo-Darwinism. The viewpoint of adaptive mutations maintains mutations occur in specific environments, also called epigenetics. This goes against the Neo-Darwinist viewpoint, which maintains the occurrence of accidental changes inherited are based on natural selection. Hence, also the theory of IQ remains unsettled. Intelligence testing began with a cousin of Charles Darwin called Francis Galton. His ideas about intelligence were popular but rejected by the committee. One member of the group was rather convinced and brought his ideas forth without a consent. A Trojan horse, obviously. Although there were a lot of mistakes about IQ too, which was a term first mentioned by Lewis Sterman, the army required some model to classify people before the First World War. So there was basically no other way but to accept the model, even though its validity wasn't tested. Currently, there are multiple views on intelligence. Thus, there happen to be different IQ tests as well. People are therefore mistaken when they talk about IQ like it is some widely accepted idea. It is unclear what intelligence is. We cannot talk about the IQ test. Different people have done different IQ tests. We can only talk about some IQ tests, not the IQ test. Another point I want to talk about is that the real difference between uneducated people and educated people is emotional intelligence, which shouldn't be confused as sociability. Emotional intelligence has more aspects to it, like how well we can deal with stress and difficult situations. Because the brain has multiple layers which evolved over time, one of our newest brains is the neocortex, used for rationalizing and thinking. Below this level, you can find the limbic system, meant for emotions and experience. Emotions and experience therefore have priority and dominates our rational thinking. If you're always feeling depressed, you cannot think as straight anymore. I hope this restores the value of people's lives and diminishes the nihilism. No, this doesn't disprove existential nihilism, of course, but this will be a topic for another time. As for ethics, you can watch my video, A Judgmental God, to know more about my meta-ethics. I base my ethics on the hypothetical imperative, as you may know. I've come a little bit closer to an universal preferable behavior, since it seems like we all strive for survival. Natural law theory seems to be the best theory, which will complement the hypothetical imperative, although that's still uncertain. It isn't difficult, however. A simple psychological investigation can answer our question to the best ethical theory. But the real problem is this. If there is no normative status to logic or mathematics, there might be no normative status to the hypothetical imperative. Now, I wasn't the only one who came up with this idea, by the way. Also, YouTuber Rationality Rules came up with this. And sorry man, there might be a chance this won't work. But remember, we have things to play with here, like these laws things. There might be something like a categorical imperative, but only instantiates itself when observed, like the notion of evolution. Okay, meaning. Now, dopamine is the reason why Elon Musk, who is also very smart, always wants more. When he has Tesla, he wants the Boring Company, and when he has the Boring Company, he started SpaceX and Neuralink and other companies he has bought. He is never satisfied with what he already has. Dopamine took over. Of course, he is also a smart person. What is also evident is the fact he has quite some dating history. With a quick Google search, I figured he dated 6 women by now. Nothing too much. It just seems he ambitions relationships in the beginning, and when things get boring, relationships fall apart. Now, a YouTube channel called Epistemix already covered Elon Musk, his personality before. I agree with Epistemix here. Money didn't satisfy him. Now he ambitions space travel and colonies on Mars. But how long will it take until he is unsatisfied and wants even more? But I disagree with him on one thing in his video. He says the worshipping of God is truly going to satisfy us, because he is infinite and has no imperfections. Watch this.
Elon Musk is probably a greater example because he has more money to spend and buy greater material things. But even he doesn't seem to be satisfied, and he wants more and more and more. He's non-stop. I mean, if you listen to his interviews, he hardly rests. And he acknowledges this is unhealthy, right? Because he's not being satisfied. You're not going to find satisfaction in this world. But when you submit yourself to the creator of the heavens and the earth, the most perfect being who has no limits, who has no imperfections, who has the most perfect names and attributes, you are going to constantly be engaged. There's not going to come a point where you say, I'm bored, I'm done. I know God now fully. I've extracted as much pleasure I could out of worshipping God and turning to God and submitting to Him and obeying Him. You're never going to reach that point.
Yes, infinite dopamine from God. Like I've shown before, there are costs to dopamine, and that is psychosis. Isaac Newton worshipped God, but he was also literally obsessed with biblical texts and occultism. Now, norepinephrine is a chemical which makes people content at the present. Too much of this chemical can reduce dopamine so much, people might not be capable of making plans for the future, in which case they cannot do anything nor have goals. In contrast, people who tend to think a lot while doing things make more dopamine but are also more likely to be depressed. A good balance of dopamine and norepinephrine makes people genuinely happy. Now, how do you do this? Building things can be a great way to be happy, for example. First, you set a goal. You want to build a birdhouse, for example. And this is an activity which requires dopamine. And during your build, you become immersed in your activity, in which case you are making norepinephrine. Building stuff can be a great way to balance your dopamine and norepinephrine. This means constant abstract thinking about God's existence or overthinking your religion is not going to make you happy, but actually psychotic or depressed. Now, I know this is not, of course, what he meant, but it is what it comes down to, essentially. But I know he didn't mean that, of course. Okay, the limitations of atheism and science. Now, as an atheist, I'm going to show the limitations of science and reason with Gödel's ontological proof. Now, Gödel's proof goes very deep, but I won't be going too deep into model logics and mathematics here. Here's a very simplified version of Gödel's ontological proof. What I'm going to talk about now comes from the following website, perrymarshall.com. And I'll be talking about some texts from this source and talk about it here in this video. Okay, first of all, he has a syllogism. It goes like this. All non-trivial computational systems are incomplete. The universe is a non-trivial computational system. Therefore, the universe is incomplete. Gödel proved that there are always more things that are true than you can prove. Any system of logic or numbers that mathematicians ever came up with will always rest on at least a few unprovable assumptions. Gödel's incompleteness theorem applies not just to math, but to everything that is subject to the laws of logic. Incompleteness is true in math. It's equally true in science or language or philosophy. Now, as far as I'm right, he also maintains every closed system relies on an unprovable system. This means reason, which is provable, must have more that must be true. Faith and reason are not opposites. One is absolutely necessary for the other to exist. Like I've talked about before, scientists need a sort of philosophical idea in order to investigate things. All reasoning ultimately traces back to faith in something that you cannot prove. Also, naturalism, which is a closed system, must rely on something outside of itself. This essentially disproves science with its limitations to naturalism. Finally, as for God's existence, Gödel proves the universe, which is a closed finite system, also relies on something greater, like God. Everything we know, space, time, objects, planets, mathematics, the laws of nature, and everything there is being encompassed by the system, this means there is no space and time outside of the universe. People would think Gödel's ontological proof proves an uncaused causer, and it might do so, but it might be incompatible with God's nature. It means God doesn't exist in time nor space, and is not material. It makes him pretty much non-existent, because everything that exists is encompassed within a closed system. God is neither complex nor is he apart. There might be a God outside of the universe, but it will not be a God who validates the God of the Bible or Islam. But that's something I'm going to occupy myself with next, God's nature. Because I think God's nature is literally incomplete. There is a lot to learn. I have shown some things about the normative status of logic and mathematics, for example. And to learn more about this, I'll be working my way up to the point I'm able to read Arthur Field's book called Truth and the Absence of Facts. I'll be reading his book called Science Without Numbers. And also will I be learning some more about God's nature and Gödel's incompleteness theorem and his ontological proof. These are very advanced topics. It will take me a very long time, because these topics are beyond my understanding right now. I will say right now, if there is more proof to God's existence, I might change some of my ideas. But I won't be turning to Christianity or the Islam. If I have to, I would most likely turn to Buddhism. But first, I need to learn, which will take time. But for now, goodbye.